Late 2024, Port of Spain felt different. Not loud different, but cautious in a way people only learn from experience. Police names started circulating, not framed as gossip, but passed around like lists already settled. Masked dudes posted near stations without rushing. Patrol routes shifted overnight, and some officers stopped sleeping at home. Regular people felt the shift early, sensing tension before any official words landed publicly. Nothing about that week felt sudden, since it carried years of fractured alliances, prison politics, and unpaid blood tabs stacking quietly. To understand why police became fair game, the story has to rewind decades, long before gangs had labels. Long before anyone said Rasta City or Muslim gang, Port of Spain was already split by lines drawn during colonial rule along the East-West corridor. British planners pushed working-class black communities eastward near docks and rail yards, while wealth settled west near hills. That layout mattered, since policing followed property first, people second, training neighborhoods to expect force quicker than protection. Young men watched patrols appear after damage, learning early who enforcement was designed to protect. By the mid-'80s, economic pressure tightened hard as oil prices dipped, unemployment climbed, and state support thinned across Laventille and Morvan. Police responses leaned on raids and sweeps instead of presence, deepening the belief that authority only showed up to punish. Labor protests and dock strikes met batons and arrests, leaving clear lessons about whose voices carried consequence. That cycle repeated across years, normalizing force as routine rather than exceptional. During that period, groups of young men were not forming gangs yet. They formed circles meant to watch the streets and protect families. These early crews handled disputes, guarded blocks during unrest, and moved together when tension rose. Respect came through presence and familiarity, not profit or branding. Criminal labels arrived later, but the foundation stayed rooted in defense and survival. Mistrust between residents and law enforcement hardened gradually through selective enforcement, punishing neighborhoods instead of individuals. Witnesses who cooperated often faced retaliation, while convictions stayed rare, reinforcing silence as safer. Young men noticed which killings triggered investigations and which disappeared quietly. That awareness shaped how value attached itself to different lives. The East-West corridor also carried memory, passed through elders who recalled colonial constables enforcing order through fear. Those memories transferred across households, shaping how children interpreted uniforms, sirens, and commands. Independence did not erase that history, since trust had already eroded. That erosion created space where unofficial leadership felt more reliable than distant governance. Through the 70s and early 80s, prisons quietly became networking hubs, connecting men from different blocks under shared pressure. Inside those walls, hierarchies formed, loyalties solidified, and reputations traveled faster than court paperwork. Release meant returning home with broader connections and deeper resentments. Street relationships expanded beyond neighborhoods, creating early alliances that authorities barely understood. By the late 80s, communities were already managing security internally, collecting information locally, and resolving disputes without official involvement. Police responses often escalated tension, since raids felt collective while accountability felt selective. That dynamic trained neighborhoods to see enforcement as an external force rather than shared protection. Once that belief settled, contesting authority became natural under pressure. So when later conflicts exploded, they followed paths already worn smooth by decades of uneven power. Gangs did not appear suddenly. They evolved from systems replacing absent trust. Understanding that origin matters, since it explains why authority in Trinidad was always contested. Before the war had names, it already carried memory, structure, and reasons waiting. July 27, 1990, did not begin as history. It started like another tense morning, and people expected to pass quietly. By mid-morning, Jamaat al-Muslimin members stormed Parliament in Port of Spain, taking Prime Minister A.N.R. Robinson hostage inside the Red House. Almost simultaneously, another unit seized Trinidad and Tobago television, forcing broadcasters to read demands live on air. The city froze, not from shock alone, but from recognition that the state itself had been breached. Power shifted instantly, since authority now looked fragile in front of regular people watching events unfold. For 6 days, Port of Spain moved under uncertainty, with fires burning downtown, looting spreading, and gunfire echoing through commercial districts. Police and military units circled without clarity, since orders kept changing while negotiations dragged. Ordinary residents stayed inside, listening to radios, watching smoke rise, and recalibrating what safety meant. The takeover was not cinematic, it was chaotic, improvised, and unsettling precisely because it looked possible. That possibility mattered more than any speech delivered from inside Parliament. When the siege ended, the surrender came wrapped in confusion rather than closure. Acting President Emmanuel Carter announced an amnesty that many did not fully understand at the moment. Courts later ruled the amnesty invalid, yet most participants never returned to prison. That outcome spoke louder than gunshots, since it suggested that extreme actions could bypass lasting consequences. Across neighborhoods, that message settled deep, especially among young men already skeptical of legal fairness. The event itself faded into dates and documentaries, but the aftermath lingered where it mattered most. Former Muslimin members returned to communities carrying stories of defiance, sacrifice, and survival. Prison time, when served, became proof of commitment rather than deterrence. Inside cells, coup narratives blended with street identity, creating a mythology stronger than ideology. That mythology circulated faster than official explanations ever could. Prisons played a central role after 1990, functioning as classrooms rather than containment spaces. Inmates linked by the coup connected with local offenders, sharing structure, discipline, and a sense of collective grievance. Hierarchies formed around experience rather than faith, shaping influence across cell blocks. Release meant returning home with expanded networks and sharpened reputations. The state unknowingly exported the organization back into neighborhoods already primed for resistance. Outside prison walls, the Muslimin compound at Musharapo Road remained symbolically important. It represented a place where the state had once been challenged and survived. Residents viewed it with mixed feelings, fear, respect, and curiosity blending together. Law enforcement treated it cautiously, avoiding heavy confrontation whenever possible. That restraint reinforced the idea that certain spaces existed beyond routine control. Over time, the word Muslim shifted in meaning across Port of Spain. It stopped pointing toward religion and started signaling affiliation, territory, and lineage. Young men identifying as Muslim often had no connection to Islamic practice or belief. The label instead communicated discipline, solidarity, and a shared history of defiance. That transformation mattered since it reframed identity away from faith toward reputation. Street conversations rarely reference theology when discussing Muslims, focusing instead on structure and reach. Being Muslim meant access to protection, influence, and established channels inside prisons. It also carried expectations around loyalty, response, and conflict engagement. Opposing groups did not argue belief systems. They challenged organizational strength. Language adapted accordingly, stripping spirituality from the name entirely. Law enforcement struggled to categorize this evolution since traditional crime labels did not fit cleanly. Intelligence reports mentioned Muslimine links without clarifying distinctions between ideology and street organization. That ambiguity allowed the label to grow unchecked, expanding beyond its original base. Police responses hesitated, unsure whether they were confronting radicals or criminals. That hesitation became another form of space. Meanwhile, younger crews observed everything carefully, absorbing lessons rather than reacting emotionally. They learned that bold action could elevate status, while consequences remained uncertain. They also saw how prisons consolidated power instead of dissolving it. The coup became less about Islam and more about strategy. Its influence lived on through behavior, not belief. By the late 90s, Muslimine identity functioned like a brand embedded within street culture. It signaled history, seriousness, and willingness to escalate when pressured. Rivals respected it, feared it, and planned around it. Neighborhood crews aligned themselves accordingly, either seeking affiliation or defining opposition. That dynamic laid the groundwork for future conflicts before those conflicts had names. Importantly, the coup altered how police viewed threats across Trinidad. Focus shifted toward intelligence gathering and preventive detention, sometimes at the expense of community trust. Raids intensified around perceived Muslim zones, increasing friction rather than resolution. Residents interpreted those actions as collective punishment, reinforcing old mistrust. Cycles repeated, pushing communities further from cooperation. Inside households, stories of 1990 became warnings and inspirations simultaneously. Elders described chaos and uncertainty, while younger listeners heard audacity and survival. Memory fragmented along generational lines, producing different takeaways from the same event. What united those interpretations was recognition that the state could be challenged. That recognition never faded. By the late 1990s, Trinidad's unemployment relief program shifted quietly from social support into something far more influential across vulnerable neighborhoods. What started as short-term work for the jobless evolved into steady cash flows controlled by intermediaries rather than ministries. Those intermediaries were rarely trained administrators, since they were already known street figures with local influence. Government officials leaned on them for speed, turnout, and compliance, trusting familiarity over oversight. That decision reshaped power structures without announcing itself publicly. URP contracts turned street presence into institutional authority almost overnight. Men who once handled block disputes suddenly controlled payroll lists, work schedules, and hiring decisions. Young men stopped asking who ran the corner and started asking who controlled the job sheet. Access to labor meant leverage, since missing work risked losing income in already strained households. Respect shifted from fear alone toward economic dependence. That transformation professionalized leadership in ways policing never anticipated. A street figure with a contract could feed dozens of families, settle conflicts, and enforce quiet through employment threats. Violence no longer stayed spontaneous or emotional, since influence came from continuity rather than impulse. Authority became administrative as much as physical. The block now answered to someone managing funds, not merely muscle. Dispute resolution followed that evolution naturally. Arguments between residents, rival crews, or even families moved toward negotiation instead of immediate retaliation. The contract holder mediated outcomes, deciding who worked, who waited, and who lost access entirely. Those decisions carried weight since they affected groceries, rent, and school supplies. Conflict shifted from fists to leverage. Territory took on new meaning during this period. Control was not just about streets or corners, but about project boundaries and operational zones. A URP contract covering certain roads effectively marked jurisdiction. Crossing into another zone risked disputes over resources rather than identity. Violence began aligning with funding edges, not long-standing rivalries. As money circulated, weapons followed predictably. Contracts provided cover for purchases, vehicles, and storage without raising suspicion. Trucks hauling equipment moved freely across neighborhoods, sometimes carrying more than tools. That mobility allowed arms to flow quietly, embedding force within legitimate operations. Law enforcement rarely connected those dots early. The calendar itself started influencing conflict patterns. Violence spiked near contract renewals, audits, or reallocations. Crews positioned themselves ahead of funding decisions, sometimes removing rivals strategically. Killings that appeared random often coincided with administrative changes. Street wars followed paperwork cycles rather than personal insults. Certain names rose during this era, though they rarely sought publicity openly. Figures like Mark Guerra in Sea Lots exemplified the fusion of contractor and street authority. Guerra managed URP work crews while controlling drug distribution and enforcing loyalty. Residents knew him as a boss who paid wages and demanded silence. That dual role normalized contradictions without explanation. Guerra's influence extended beyond his immediate area through alliances and intimidation. He negotiated with politicians, coordinated with other contract holders, and punished dissent efficiently. Community events sponsored through URP money reinforced his legitimacy publicly. Yet violence surrounded his operations quietly, targeting rivals threatening revenue streams. That balance kept order while maintaining fear. Other figures followed similar paths across Port of Spain. In Laventille, Morvan, and Beetham Gardens, local leaders mirrored the template. They organized labor, distributed funds, and enforced boundaries with calculated restraint. Their names circulated through whispers rather than headlines. Authority became localized, layered, and difficult to dismantle. Police responses struggled to adapt to this hybrid structure. Arresting a contract holder disrupted employment for entire blocks, risking unrest. Raids targeting criminal activity often halted public works, drawing complaints from residents. Enforcement actions created collateral consequences that politicians preferred to avoid. That hesitation granted further insulation. Over time, residents adjusted expectations accordingly. Complaints went to contract holders before police precincts. Disputes resolved internally saved time and reduced retaliation risks. Trust shifted downward toward familiar figures rather than distant institutions. Street government matured organically through necessity. This arrangement blurred moral lines extensively. A man financing school supplies could also order hits without contradiction. Communities accepted complexity since alternatives looked worse. The system rewarded efficiency over legality. That trade-off hardened as years passed. Violence changed character under this structure. It became targeted, strategic, and transactional. Elimination served business interests rather than emotional vendettas. Retaliation slowed, since escalation threatened revenue continuity. Order mattered more than dominance displays. However, this stability remained fragile. Contracts were temporary, renewable, and politically influenced. Each funding cycle reopened the competition. Rivals positioned themselves for upcoming allocations, sometimes sabotaging incumbents. Peace held only while money flowed predictably. When contracts shifted suddenly, violence returned sharply. A removed contractor lost leverage overnight. Crews tied to him fractured or defected. Those moments produced spikes in shootings that puzzled outsiders. Inside neighborhoods, causes were understood clearly. Prisons amplified these dynamics further. Incarcerated leaders coordinated bids for contracts through proxies. Cell blocks became planning spaces for future allocations. Release dates aligned with funding windows strategically. Street and prison economies synchronized tightly. Government oversight remained inconsistent throughout. Audits focused on paperwork rather than ground reality. Employment numbers mattered more than power dynamics. Officials measured success through outputs, not stability. That blindness allowed structures to deepen. By the mid-2000s, street government operated parallel to formal governance. It handled employment, mediation, enforcement, and resource distribution locally. Residents navigated both systems depending on the circumstance. Authority felt plural rather than singular. This environment shaped younger participants significantly. Aspiring leaders studied administration as much as street survival. Respect came from organization, not chaos. Violence served a function, not impulse. That lesson carried forward into later generations. The template established during this era endured even after prominent figures fell. Assassinations removed individuals but preserved the structure. Successors stepped into systems already normalized. The street government outlived its founders. Understanding this shift explains why later wars followed money rather than personal insult. Funding disputes drove alliances, betrayals, and executions. Identity became secondary to access. Power meant payroll control more than intimidation alone. By the time newer factions emerged, the blueprint was already written. Street authority meant managing resources under pressure. Violence enforces contracts rather than pride. That evolution set the stage for deeper fragmentation ahead. What began as relief work reshaped Trinidad's underworld fundamentally. It professionalized crime through legitimate channels. It blurred criminality with governance seamlessly. That transformation explains why dismantling gangs became far harder later. When street government took root, reversing it required replacing functions, not removing faces. The state never filled that vacuum effectively. As a result, power remained contested, transactional, and ready to fracture. The consequences would unfold violently soon enough. Rasta City did not appear as a manifesto, doctrine, or structured belief system announced publicly to the country. It emerged quietly as a reaction, built from resentment toward domination rather than commitment to philosophy. Young men across East Port of Spain felt boxed in by older power structures they did not control. The Muslim network already carried history, prison reach, and reputational weight that shaped every negotiation. Rasta City formed through opposition, meaning identity developed from resistance more than shared ideology. That distinction explains why coherence came from shared pressure instead of unified thinking. The name Rasta City carried cultural weight even when religion barely entered the conversation. Rastafari imagery symbolized defiance, black pride, and refusal to bow to authority figures. For youths raised around selective policing and limited opportunity, the symbolism mattered more than belief. saying Rasta City signaled alignment with resistance rather than spiritual commitment. That framing allowed anyone to belong regardless of actual practice. Identity stayed flexible while reputation stayed firm. Street conversations rarely discussed doctrine when referencing Rasta City membership or affiliation. People focused on the loyalty, response time, and willingness to stand their ground under pressure. The name worked as shorthand for attitude, not faith. It communicated refusal to submit quietly to establish dominance. That message resonated strongly among younger crews searching for autonomy. Language created unity where philosophy never could. Early expansion followed social pathways instead of formal recruitment channels. Friends brought friends, relatives pulled relatives, and prison ties bridged neighborhoods previously disconnected. Rasta City spread through familiarity, not indoctrination. Shared grievances created cohesion faster than organized messaging. This organic growth allowed flexibility, though it limited centralized control. Strength came from numbers rather than hierarchy. Initial friction with the Muslim network defined Rasta City's trajectory immediately. Muslims controlled older prison alliances, contract access, and territorial recognition. Rasta City challenged that dominance through visibility rather than negotiation. Encounters escalated quickly since neither side trusted compromise. Every confrontation hardened reputations further. Conflict became structural rather than personal. Territorial boundaries were solidified through repeated clashes rather than official declarations. Certain streets became understood lines where crossing signaled intent. Residents learned boundaries through experience rather than maps. Those invisible borders shaped daily movement patterns quietly. Respecting lines became survival knowledge. Violations invited consequences swiftly. Reputational codes emerged during these early conflicts. Response speed mattered more than body counts initially. A delayed reaction suggested weakness, while quick retaliation signaled seriousness. Displays focused on presence, not chaos. Each incident reinforced expectations around behavior. The code spread through observation rather than instruction. As confrontations continued, prisons absorbed participants from both sides consistently. Incarceration did not pause conflict, it reorganized it. Inside facilities, Rasta City members clustered naturally around shared opposition. They learned structure from necessity rather than planning. Prison yards became classrooms, shaping discipline and loyalty. Authority formed around experience rather than charisma. Prison environments accelerated hierarchy development beyond street pace. Access to protection, contraband, and communication required organization. Older inmates mentored younger ones, teaching protocols and boundaries. Loyalty hardened under shared confinement pressure. Release carried those lessons back outside. Prison time became a credential rather than a setback. Muslim network dominance inside facilities forced Rasta City members to adapt quickly. They developed tighter internal cohesion to counter established influence. Identity sharpened through conflict rather than cooperation. Rivalry deepened since proximity inside walls removed distance. Every slight carried amplified meaning. The feud matured structurally. Outside prison, Rasta City operated as a loose federation rather than a centralized command. Neighborhood crews retained autonomy while aligning symbolically. That decentralization made suppression difficult. Removing one group did not weaken the whole. Strength came from redundancy rather than leadership. The network behaved like an organism rather than a hierarchy. Cultural expression reinforced identity during this phase. clothing choices, music preferences, and slang carried signals. Rasta imagery blended with local street style seamlessly. Symbols communicated allegiance without explanation. Outsiders recognized alignment instantly. Culture substituted for formal membership cards. Music amplified messaging organically. Lyrics referenced defiance, survival, and resistance without religious framing. Songs circulated through neighborhoods and prison radios alike. Sound became another unifying channel. Youth absorbed identity through rhythm rather than speeches. Culture traveled faster than organization. Law enforcement struggled to interpret Rasta City accurately. Officials searched for an ideology where none guided behavior. Misreading intentions delayed an effective response. Rasta City functioned through relationships, not doctrine. That mismatch allowed expansion. Early violence followed reputational logic rather than resource competition. Clashes aimed to establish standing, not control markets yet. That phase remained volatile and unpredictable. Retaliation cycles reinforced boundaries quickly. Casualties served messaging more than profit. The tone stayed confrontational. Over time, repeated incarcerations tightened internal discipline further. Members learned discretion, patience, and strategic thinking. Spontaneous actions declined gradually. Planning replaced impulse. Prison hardened structure faster than street exposure ever could. The organization matured under pressure. Community perception of Rasta City varied widely during this rise. Some residents viewed them as reckless youths, challenging order. Others saw them as a necessary counterbalance to entrenched power. That ambiguity allowed coexistence initially. Acceptance depended on local interactions. Authority remained negotiated daily. As Rasta City expanded, alignment choices became unavoidable for neighboring crews. Neutrality grew difficult under pressure. Groups either affiliated, resisted, or relocated. This sorting process intensified polarization. The city segmented into zones defined by allegiance. Movement required constant awareness. The first real split emerged quietly within Rasta City itself. Differences surfaced around strategy, response thresholds, and prison influence. Some members favored restraint, others preferred aggression. Debates rarely stayed verbal. Fractures formed along generational lines. Unity strained under growth. Prisons magnified those internal tensions dramatically. Younger members clashed with elders over direction. Access to resources inside fueled competition. Influence depended on numbers and connections. Disagreements hardened into factions. The seeds of future division took root. By the time authorities noticed fragmentation signs, alignment patterns had solidified. Groups identified with subsets rather than the whole. Loyalty narrowed toward immediate circles. Identity remained Rasta City publicly, but allegiance shifted privately. Dual layers emerged. These developments explain why later splits felt inevitable rather than surprising. Growth without a central ideology invited divergence. Resistance unified early, but sustainability demanded structure. Without doctrine, loyalty followed power dynamics. Prisons accelerated that evolution relentlessly. Rasta City's rise reshaped Trinidad's street landscape permanently. It challenged established dominance and rewrote reputational rules. Identity detached from belief and attached to opposition. Prisons molded hierarchy more than streets ever could. That transformation prepared the ground for deeper fractures ahead. Between 2000 and 2010, violence in Trinidad stopped feeling episodic and started behaving like a steady condition people learned to live around. Murders climbed gradually, not through sudden explosions, but through accumulation tied to contract shifts, prison releases, and widening drug corridors. Every release date mattered, since returning figures came back with expectations, unresolved tensions, and updated loyalties shaped behind bars. Street balance was rarely adjusted smoothly, since old arrangements collapsed once key players re-entered circulation. That instability fed an environment where retaliation felt unfinished rather than resolved. URP contracts continued influencing conflicts during this period, but competition grew sharper as funding tightened and scrutiny increased. Losing a contract meant losing leverage, status, and the ability to control younger crews dependent on wages. Rivals timed pressure around those transitions, sometimes forcing incumbents out through intimidation or targeted violence. Killings that appeared personal often coincided with administrative deadlines, quietly shaping outcomes. Money trails guided bloodshed more reliably than insults. Drug routes expanded during these years, especially with cocaine transshipment increasing through Caribbean corridors. Trinidad's ports, coastline, and proximity made it valuable within larger networks. Control over landing zones and storage locations brought new stakes. Older street disputes escalated once international supply chains entered the picture. Profit multiplied tension rather than stabilizing it. Automatic weapons changed the texture of violence decisively. Handguns once supported targeted hits, limiting collateral damage through proximity and familiarity. Assault rifles altered that rhythm, introducing distance, volume, and unpredictability. Shootouts spilled across streets instead of corners. Bystanders became casualties rather than witnesses. Fear widened beyond the involved parties. Retaliation patterns shifted accordingly. One killing rarely settled scores, since automatic fire invited broader responses. Crews responded with greater force to demonstrate capability rather than precision. Displays mattered more than outcomes. Violence communicated readiness instead of resolution. Each exchange widened the circle of grievance. Police responses followed predictable cycles throughout this decade. High-profile murders triggered raids, checkpoints, and temporary saturation patrols. Communities quieted briefly under pressure. Weapons went underground. Movement slowed, and visible conflict paused. That calm rarely lasted longer than weeks. Once crackdowns eased, violence returned sharper and more aggressive. Crews compensated for lost time and perceived vulnerability. Retaliation accelerated to reassert standing. The rebound often exceeded previous levels. Residents learned to anticipate spikes following enforcement withdrawal. Arrests rarely removed leadership permanently during this era. Detentions shuffled power rather than dismantling it. Incarceration reinforced bonds, transferred knowledge, and created new alliances. Released individuals returned with enhanced status, having survived pressure. Prison time became proof of commitment rather than deterrence. Funerals multiplied across neighborhoods, becoming social gatherings, marking loss and allegiance simultaneously. Attendance signaled alignment publicly. Absence carried meaning too. These events extended the conflict socially, reinforcing divisions beyond active participants. Grief blended with obligation seamlessly. The absence of closure defined this decade most sharply. Cases stalled, witnesses withdrew, and convictions remained rare. Families carried unanswered questions indefinitely. Communities internalized justice rather than expecting it externally. Each unresolved killing added weight to the collective memory. That memory functioned like a ledger, recording wrongs without expiration. New generations inherited grievances they never witnessed. Stories replaced facts over time, hardening perceptions further. Retaliation addressed history rather than immediate triggers. Violence referenced past debts as justification. Neighborhood boundaries hardened further as casualties accumulated. Movement across zones required negotiation or escorts. Everyday routines adapted around perceived safety corridors. Children learned geography through risk assessment rather than maps, and normalcy adjusted downward gradually. Media coverage increased visibility but not understanding. Headlines counted bodies without context. Statistics replaced narratives. Public concern rose, yet solutions remained elusive. Communities felt spoken about rather than engaged. The distance between perception and lived reality widened. Drug profits amplified internal conflicts within crews as well. Disagreements over distribution and revenue sharing sparked internal purges. Loyalty fractured under financial pressure. Leadership changed through violence rather than consensus. Instability fed outward aggression. Women and elders felt the impact acutely during this period. They navigated households around unpredictable schedules. Mourning became routine. Fear integrated into daily planning. Community resilience strained under constant loss. Churches, schools, and social groups attempted intervention sporadically. Efforts lacked continuity or protection. Mediators faced intimidation. Programs collapsed once funding ended. Temporary relief did not address structural causes. International influences increased subtly during these years. Firearms flowed through regional channels. Techniques spread through migration and incarceration. Trinidad's violence reflected broader patterns beyond its borders. Local conflict plugged into global currents quietly. Police officers experienced burnout and distrust simultaneously. Long hours produced fatigue. Community suspicion limited cooperation. Informants faced lethal risk. Intelligence gathering stalled frequently. Enforcement felt reactive rather than strategic. Political responses emphasized toughness rhetorically while avoiding systemic overhaul. Emergency measures addressed symptoms. Structural issues persisted. Short-term gains overshadowed long-term planning. The cycle repeated predictably. By the late 2000s, the idea of peace felt abstract across affected neighborhoods. Violence normalized to the point of expectation. People measured weeks by incidents. Calm periods raised suspicion rather than relief. Anticipation replaced surprise. Young men growing up during this decade internalized conflict as background noise. Aspirations adjusted accordingly. Survival strategies overshadowed ambition. Identity formed around resilience rather than opportunity. That conditioning shaped future behavior decisively. Between 2011 and 2015, the state leaned hard on emergency powers, selling control through visibility rather than dismantling underlying command systems. Curfews, checkpoints, and mass searches slowed street movement quickly, creating the impression that pressure alone could restore order. Shootings dipped for short stretches, which officials cited as proof the strategy worked. Communities felt temporary relief, yet familiar figures remained untouched within custody. The calm never addressed who was giving instructions or how those orders traveled. The first major state of emergency reshaped daily life without reshaping authority. Soldiers patrolled intersections, police flooded neighborhoods, and residents adjusted routines around enforcement presence. Weapons disappeared briefly from public view, not from circulation entirely. Crews stored firearms, paused open conflict, and waited out restrictions patiently. Everyone understood the pressure had an expiration date. Once restrictions were lifted, activity resumed with sharper intent and better coordination. Violence returned concentrated rather than scattered, signaling planning rather than impulse. Crews used the quiet period to reorganize relationships and resources. Retaliation followed schedules instead of emotions. The rebound demonstrated that suppression had interrupted symptoms without disrupting leadership. Incarceration during this period strengthened networks instead of fracturing them. High-profile arrests placed rival leaders together inside facilities, forcing interaction under controlled conditions. Conflicts cooled temporarily behind walls, replaced by negotiation and alignment. Prison yards became neutral zones for planning rather than battlegrounds. Shared confinement encouraged consolidation. Leadership hierarchies were clarified rapidly inside. Senior figures established authority through reputation, access, and experience. Younger inmates learned protocols, communication discipline, and strategic patience. Rules were standardized across groups previously operating independently. Release carried those lessons outward, synchronizing behavior across neighborhoods. Ideology spread faster in custody than on the street. Narratives around resistance, loyalty, and inevitability circulated through conversations and shared reading. Grievances reframed into collective stories explaining loss and retaliation. Prison time deepened commitment rather than weakening it. Belief systems solidified under pressure. Communication channels have evolved over the years. Smuggled phones, coded messages, and intermediaries bridged inside and outside seamlessly. Instructions traveled quietly through family visits and trusted couriers. Orders felt detached from immediate risk. Distance created confidence. Street crews increasingly deferred decisions upward to incarcerated leaders. Local disputes paused pending approval. Retaliation required authorization rather than impulse. Authority centralized without public acknowledgement. The chain of command hardened invisibly. Emergency powers failed to disrupt these channels effectively. Searches confiscated weapons but missed relationships. Arrests removed foot soldiers while preserving strategists. Intelligence gathered focused on locations, not communication webs. Enforcement targeted movement rather than influence. Communities noticed the disconnect gradually. Raids captured familiar faces while known decision-makers remained untouched. Trust eroded further as promises of safety proved temporary. Residents learned to expect cycles rather than solutions. Normalcy recalibrated downward again. Inside facilities, alignment across previously rival groups increased. Shared opposition toward enforcement fostered cooperation. Conflicts reframed around long-term advantage instead of immediate pride. Planning replaced reaction. Violence became more efficient. By 2013, signs emerged that street wars followed prison calendars. Incidents clustered around sentencing dates, transfers, and releases. Power shifts inside triggered adjustments outside. Street commanders awaited signals from cells. The pattern became predictable to those watching closely. Law enforcement acknowledged the issue quietly while struggling publicly. Efforts to isolate leaders through segregation faced legal and logistical barriers. Communication restrictions lagged behind evolving methods. Each adaptation met a countermeasure. The contest favored flexibility. The illusion of control peaked during successive emergency declarations. Politicians highlighted reduced homicide numbers briefly. The media echoed success narratives. Meanwhile, structure strengthened beneath the surface. Calm masked preparation. By this stage, command centers no longer required physical presence on streets. Decisions originated from cells, traveled through networks, and were executed remotely. Leadership enjoyed insulation from immediate retaliation. Street participants absorbed risk while planners remained distant. This separation altered accountability dynamics. Violence became depersonalized for those ordering actions. Consequences felt abstract behind walls. Moral restraint weakened accordingly. Efficiency replaced hesitation. Prisons also facilitated cross-regional coordination. Inmates from different zones shared strategies and resources. Alliances formed across geographic boundaries. Rivalries softened when mutual benefit emerged. The map redrew itself quietly. Emergency powers could not address this transformation effectively. Measures focused on space control while authority existed relationally. Occupying streets did not occupy minds. Enforcement visibility failed to penetrate planning layers. Control remained superficial. The system's failure point approached as confidence grew among incarcerated leaders. They tested limits through coordinated actions outside. Responses lagged behind signals. Each successful execution reinforced belief in invulnerability. Escalation followed naturally. By 2015, cracks appeared publicly through incidents defying suppression efforts. Attacks occurred despite heavy patrols. Intelligence warnings went unheeded or arrived too late. The gap between appearance and reality widened dangerously. This period revealed a core truth gradually. The state controlled the territory temporarily, not permanently. Prisons functioned as operational hubs rather than endpoints. Authority flowed inward instead of outward. The illusion of control dissolved quietly. The exposure of this failure set the stage for a decisive rupture. Once confidence in remote command solidified, restraint diminished. Systems built to contain power had concentrated it. The next event would reveal the consequences openly. In July 2015, containment inside the Port of Spain prison collapsed through access and coordination that exposed deep internal compromise rather than spontaneous chaos. Two inmates, Jason Abbas Muhammad and Anstey Zeeks Charles, moved with confidence that immediately signaled planning, familiarity, and cooperation beyond inmate capability alone. Firearms appeared inside secure walls through channels requiring transport, concealment, and deliberate assistance, which stripped away any remaining illusion of airtight control. Guards were disarmed, keys accessed, and movement timed precisely, revealing corruption as operational reality rather than whispered suspicion. As the escape unfolded, confusion spread faster than verified information, while official explanations lagged behind what street networks already understood clearly. Outside communities recognized quickly that this was not desperation, but execution shaped by inside knowledge and external coordination. Shots were fired inside the prison, killed an officer, transforming the escape into an irreversible escalation with consequences far beyond custody management. That death reframed the event entirely, turning a breach into a declaration that containment itself had been penetrated. Inside the prison, power dynamics shifted immediately as remaining inmates recalculated loyalties and questioned the integrity of institutional authority. Trust in containment evaporated overnight, since the walls no longer guaranteed predictability or safety. Groups suspected internal collaborators while simultaneously fearing retaliation from those who escaped. Hierarchies that relied on stability cracked under uncertainty, and everyone understood that rules were suddenly negotiable. Outside the walls, the impact landed harder and faster, reshaping perceptions across neighborhoods already conditioned by years of violence. Affiliates tied to the escapees gained symbolic elevation overnight as influence now appeared capable of reaching inside state infrastructure. Rivals interpreted the breach as proof of protected access rather than isolated luck. Confidence surged among some groups while paranoia consumed others, adjusting rapidly to the new reality. Deaths connected to the escape intensified instability across the network, especially since the fallen officer represented escalation beyond accepted boundaries. Public outrage pressured authorities into visible responses that emphasized optics over structural correction. Communities interpreted the moment differently, focusing less on the loss and more on what the breach revealed about systemic weakness. That interpretation shaped behavior more strongly than official messaging ever could. Alliances that once relied on prison-based negotiation collapsed almost instantly under suspicion and fear of exposure. Groups questioned who had advanced knowledge, who assisted quietly, and who benefited indirectly through shifted balances. Conversations moved from coordination toward verification and silence. Fragmentation accelerated visibly as trust dissolved across networks. Inside facilities, retaliation anxiety reshaped daily behavior as inmates distanced themselves from former partners. Information sharing declined sharply, and leadership credibility weakened as protection appeared uncertain. Command structures loosened under stress, replaced by defensive clustering and cautious interaction. Unity eroded as survival instincts replaced strategic cooperation. Outside, street crews reacted by aggressively securing territory, resources, and personnel. Trust between previously aligned groups evaporated rapidly, ending informal protection agreements without discussion. Old understandings dissolved as verification replaced familiarity. Violence increased as crews relied on force rather than assumption to establish position. The escape functioned like a stress test, exposing fault lines across the entire ecosystem simultaneously. Hierarchies built over decades cracked under pressure as authority based on reputation weakened once security proved porous. Influence now required fresh demonstrations rather than inherited standing. Chaos replaced predictability as the governing condition. Law enforcement responses centered heavily on recapture efforts, diverting attention from broader structural consequences unfolding quietly. Resources poured into manhunts while networks reorganized beyond immediate scrutiny. Communities observed the imbalance closely, noting protection felt secondary to spectacle. Trust eroded further as enforcement appeared reactive rather than preventative. The escape altered how gangs viewed prisons fundamentally, shifting perception from endpoint toward launch point for future action. Containment lost its deterrent edge once escape proved feasible through corruption and access. Strategic thinking adjusted accordingly, with incarceration reframed as an opportunity rather than a risk. That realization reshaped planning across networks. Communication patterns shifted rapidly after the escape as leaders reduced reliance on centralized command structures, fearing exposure. Smaller autonomous cells began operating independently, limiting information flow and increasing fragmentation. Decisions decentralized quickly, replacing hierarchy with compartmentalization. That shift altered violence patterns significantly. Decentralization accelerated splintering across networks as subgroups pursued independent agendas instead of shared strategies. Loyalty narrowed toward immediate circles rather than broader affiliations. Identity weakened while survival instincts sharpened. Fragmentation replaced cohesion as the dominant operational mode. Trust between gangs fractured almost overnight, dissolving shared history as a foundation for cooperation. Past alliances became liabilities under suspicion, and verification replaced familiarity entirely. Every interaction carried risk, and caution governed movement. The social fabric of coordination unraveled rapidly. Risk calculations transformed following the escape, as actions previously avoided now felt achievable under perceived protection. Boundaries blurred between possible and forbidden, altering behavior patterns widely. Consequences appeared negotiable rather than fixed. Escalation followed naturally as restraint lost grounding. Older hierarchies struggled to adapt to the new decentralized environment, since structures designed for centralized control failed under fragmentation. Younger actors exploited gaps quickly, leveraging adaptability over experience. Power redistributed unevenly across networks, and authority lost predictability. Inside remaining facilities, prison leadership lost credibility as containment promises rang hollow. Authority grounded in protection eroded rapidly, weakening discipline and coordination. Inmates questioned guarantees previously taken seriously. Fragmentation deepened under uncertainty. Narratives of invincibility spread after the escape, fueled by exaggeration and fear rather than verified information. Stories inflated access and reach beyond reality, amplifying psychological impact. Perception reshaped behavior more than facts. Fear multiplied influence. Communities experienced renewed instability as violence patterns shifted unpredictably across previously stable zones. Disputes escalated faster, mediation collapsed, and retaliation cycles shortened dramatically. Casualties increased beyond expected boundaries. Anxiety spread across everyday routines. Politically, the incident marked a turning point as confidence in containment strategies collapsed publicly. Emergency rhetoric intensified while structural reform remained absent. Reaction replaced long-term planning once again. The cycle repeated predictably. The escape exposed systemic compromise unmistakably, transforming corruption and complicity from abstract discussions into measurable outcomes. Expectations shifted permanently across communities and networks. Containment no longer felt reliable. Trust eroded at every level. From this moment forward, fragmentation replaced hierarchy as the dominant condition across the conflict landscape. Old structures lingered symbolically while losing operational authority. Power scattered among competing nodes. Violence reflected decentralization rather than command. This moment functioned as a hinge between eras, separating contained order from uncontrolled fragmentation decisively. Everything that followed traced back to this rupture. Trust never fully recovered afterward. Alliances never stabilized again. The prison break did not initiate new conflicts, but removed constraints holding existing ones together. Once containment failed visibly, restraint lost meaning across networks. The streets adapted quickly. From 2015 onward, authority existed in fragments rather than chains, and violence followed unpredictability instead of hierarchy. The consequences multiplied rapidly, and the war entered its most unstable phase. Rasta City did not collapse through ideological debates or spiritual disagreements. It fractured through pressure applied unevenly across age, access, and opportunity. Older members carried memories of containment, negotiation, and prison discipline, while younger participants grew up during fragmentation and instability. Those generations wanted different outcomes from the same identity, creating tension that could not be smoothed over internally. Economic pressure amplified those divides, since contracts, routes, and influence no longer flowed predictably. Fracture followed necessity rather than philosophy, reshaping alignment through survival rather than belief. 6 and 7 emerge from that split as practical responses to competition rather than organized declarations. Younger members gravitated toward 7, seeking speed, visibility, and immediate impact without extended consultation. Older figures leaned toward 6, valuing structure, verification, and disciplined response shaped through years of incarceration. Neither side claimed moral superiority, since both framed choices as realistic under current conditions. The split hardened as resources dwindled and trust eroded simultaneously. Economic shifts played a central role in accelerating the division between 6 and 7. Funding channels narrowed, drug routes fragmented, and leadership credibility weakened following containment failures. Younger actors wanted fast gains and flexible alliances, while elders preferred controlled expansion and negotiated boundaries. That disagreement translated directly into operational conflict. Each side viewed the other as a liability rather than a partner. Prisons magnified these differences dramatically, since separation forced alignment within confined spaces. Inmates clustered by outlook rather than shared history, forming camps around operational philosophy. 6 affiliates emphasized discipline, communication, restraint, and layered protection. 7 supporters favored aggressive posture, rapid retaliation, and visible dominance. That division carried back outside upon release. As 6 and 7 solidified, numbers replaced names as identity shorthand across neighborhoods. Saying a number communicated allegiance instantly without explanation. Graffiti, clothing, and online posts carried digits instead of symbols. Numbers traveled faster than words, carrying threat without conversation. Language simplified conflict into signals that everyone understood. Numbers also functioned as branding inside prisons, marking loyalty through subtle gestures rather than declarations. Cell placement, yard movement, and association followed numeric alignment. Guards noticed patterns without fully decoding the meaning. That ambiguity protected participants while reinforcing division. Identity embedded itself into daily behavior. A BG emerged differently from both 6 and 7, rejecting structure itself as a constraint. Younger members, frustrated by hierarchy, gravitated toward unpredictability rather than territory. A BG did not prioritize holding space, since movement mattered more than boundaries. Their approach favored shock over stability. That mindset attracted those with little patience for negotiation. Unlike 6 and 7, ABG operated through loose affiliation rather than defined membership. Participation shifted constantly, reducing vulnerability to targeted suppression. Decisions happened quickly without centralized approval. Violence served disruption rather than a message. Chaos functioned as protection. A BG's rejection of structure destabilized existing expectations rapidly. Old rules around response time, verification, and mediation have lost relevance. Actions occurred without warning or explanation. Rivals struggled to anticipate behavior. Fear replaced calculation across affected areas. Civilians felt the impact immediately as old informal protections disappeared. Previously, residents navigated boundaries through known rules and relationships. Fragmentation erased predictability. Crossing streets carried risk regardless of familiarity. Daily routines required constant reassessment. Numbers replaced neighborhood names in threat language, simplifying intimidation across spaces. A painted digit carried a warning stronger than verbal confrontation. Residents understood the meaning without clarification. Silence followed the markings quickly. Fear traveled efficiently. Online spaces amplified numeric identity further. Posts reference numbers rather than faces, complicating accountability. Threats circulated rapidly without physical presence. Rumors spread faster than verification. Anxiety multiplied beyond immediate zones. Prisons reflected this fragmentation sharply as well. Yard politics shifted toward numeric alignment rather than shared history. Protection depended on digits rather than reputation alone. Conflicts ignited faster under compressed conditions. Containment struggled to adapt. Older figures attempted mediation initially, seeking to preserve some coherence. Their influence waned as unpredictability increased. Younger actors dismissed restraint as weakness. Authority fractured further with each failed negotiation. Leadership aged out rapidly. Economic desperation intensified fragmentation further. Limited access to funding pushed crews toward opportunistic violence. Cooperation became a liability under scarcity. Betrayals increased. Short-term survival overshadowed long-term positioning. Civilians became collateral within this new environment, lacking reliable channels for safety. Appeals to familiar figures failed as authority dissolved. Police intervention felt distant and inconsistent. Communities absorbed pressure quietly. Trauma accumulated without an outlet. Schools, shops, and transport routes were adjusted under fear. Attendance dropped, businesses closed earlier, and movement was restricted informally. Social life contracted inward. Normalcy narrowed steadily. The city felt smaller. The breakdown of old rules removed informal restraints that once limited harm. Previously avoided targets became acceptable under fragmentation. Violence spilled into neutral spaces. Innocence lost protection quietly. Boundaries dissolved. 6 and 7 conflicts intensified as competition sharpened. Each side tested the other's resolve repeatedly. Retaliation cycles shortened. Displays replaced dialogue. Escalation became routine. A BG exploited that tension opportunistically, striking unpredictably and retreating quickly. Their actions disrupted negotiations and inflamed responses. Both 6 and 7 struggled to contain the fallout. Instability fed further chaos. Numbers continued replacing names in everyday language, reducing conflict to abstraction. Dehumanization follows simplification. Fear operated efficiently without explanation. Violence felt impersonal. By this stage, Rasta City existed only as memory and reference, not function and unity. Fragmentation defined reality. Allegiance narrowed constantly. Identity splintered beyond repair. This period marked an irreversible transition from structured rivalry to uncontrolled competition. Old hierarchies lost relevance entirely. Authority scattered permanently. Violence follows fragmentation. Civilians remain trapped within this transformation, adapting daily without security. Survival required constant awareness. Trust dissolved across neighborhoods. The cost extended beyond participants. The breaking of Rasta City reshaped Trinidad's conflict landscape permanently. What followed lacked restraint or coherence. Fragmentation ruled. The war entered its most unpredictable phase. By 2019, violence stopped feeling distant or contained since killings began unfolding in places everyone recognized and routines everyone shared. The shift mattered because bloodshed moved from coded spaces into everyday environments without warning or explanation. That year forced the wider public to acknowledge a war previously discussed quietly or ignored entirely. Fear stopped being localized and became communal, shaping how people planned ordinary movement. Once that boundary collapsed, avoidance stopped working as a strategy. The chain of killings followed patterns insiders understood, but outsiders struggled to interpret without context. Murders clustered around figures known for holding fragile balances between competing factions. Those deaths removed buffers, quietly managing disputes behind the scenes. Each assassination destabilized multiple relationships simultaneously, not just immediate circles. The impact rippled outward faster than replacements could emerge. High-profile killings shocked communities precisely because they targeted stabilizing figures rather than loud aggressors. Men known for mediation, restraint, or negotiation became primary targets suddenly. Their removal created leadership vacuums that no one rushed to fill responsibly. Authority fragmented further once those anchors disappeared. Violence accelerated as guidance vanished. These assassinations carried clear messages beyond the immediate act. Killing a stabilizer warned others against playing intermediary roles. It discouraged negotiation by attaching lethal consequences. Silence became safer than involvement. Communities lost informal channels for conflict resolution quickly. Public attention intensified once killings occurred in daylight and populated areas. Shootings near schools, markets, and transport hubs erased any illusion of separation. Videos circulated within minutes, spreading shock beyond neighborhoods directly affected. The city collectively absorbed images without preparation. Fear became a shared experience rather than a rumor. Rumors amplified every incident rapidly, filling information gaps with speculation and exaggeration. WhatsApp messages claimed responsibility, predicted retaliation, or named future targets without verification. Anxiety escalated as people trusted forwarded messages over official updates. False information traveled faster than corrections. Panic often preceded facts. Social media accelerated paranoia dramatically by collapsing the distance between events and perception. Posts referenced numbers, colors, and emojis, signaling allegiance or threat. Meaning circulated without explanation, relying on shared fear. Screens delivered menace directly into homes. Avoidance felt impossible. Music also played a role during this period, reflecting and amplifying street realities simultaneously. Lyrics referenced recent killings, locations, and affiliations without naming them directly. Songs traveled through communities faster than conversations. As narratives circulated, retaliation cycles shortened significantly. Groups responded to perceived slights rather than confirmed actions. Violence preempted dialogue. Assumptions guided decisions more than evidence. Mistakes multiplied under pressure. Bystanders increasingly paid the price as control slipped further. Bullets traveled without precision during attacks meant for specific individuals. Innocent people found themselves caught between signals they could not read. Safety became unpredictable. Casualties extended beyond participants consistently. Families adjusted routines constantly, changing routes, schedules, and habits unpredictably. Children learned to identify danger through sound rather than instruction. Elders avoided public spaces altogether. Normal life shrank under pressure. Fear dictated behavior quietly. Hospitals felt strain as trauma cases increased unpredictably. Medical staff adjusted to sudden influxes following public shootings. Emergency rooms became familiar spaces for grieving families. Stress compounded across systems. Violence produced ripple effects beyond immediate scenes. Police presence increased visibly during this period, but reassurance remained limited. Patrols responded to incidents rather than preventing escalation. Communities perceived enforcement as reactive rather than protective. Trust did not rebound. Visibility did not equal safety. Leadership vacuums widened as assassinations removed experienced figures rapidly. Younger actors stepped forward without preparation or restraint. Decisions leaned toward aggression rather than mediation. Escalation followed instinct rather than strategy. Consequences multiplied accordingly. Public confidence eroded further as explanations failed to match lived reality. Official statements minimized patterns while residents experienced continuity. Discrepancy bred skepticism. People trusted personal networks more than institutions. Information fragmented further. Funerals multiplied during this year, becoming markers of instability rather than closure. Attendance carried risk as well as obligation. Each gathering felt vulnerable. Grief mixed with vigilance constantly. Mourning required a strategy. Rumors surrounding upcoming attacks spread fear even without confirmation. Entire areas shut down temporarily based on forwarded messages alone. Businesses closed early without explanation. Movement halted sporadically. Fear reshaped the city's rhythm. Online taunts escalated conflicts further, allowing provocation without physical presence. Posts mocked losses, threatened retaliation, or exaggerated reach. Screens became battlegrounds, shaping real-world behavior. Accountability felt distant. Escalation followed digital cues. Music videos filmed in contested spaces added another layer of tension. Viewers interpreted backgrounds and gestures as messages. Visuals amplified paranoia. Meaning attached itself easily. Art became evidence unintentionally. Bystanders lost faith in informal protection mechanisms that once existed. Familiar faces no longer guaranteed safety. Boundaries dissolved under fragmentation. Movement required constant reassessment. Stress accumulated quietly. Children absorbed trauma indirectly through altered routines and whispered warnings. School attendance fluctuated unpredictably. Concentration suffered under anxiety. Childhood adapted to vigilance prematurely. The cost extended generationally. Media coverage intensified but often lacked nuance, focusing on numbers rather than context. Headlines counted bodies without explaining the dynamics. Public discourse flattened complexity. Solutions appeared distant. Fear dominated the conversation. As killings continued, the idea of neutrality disappeared entirely. Residents felt pressure to align or isolate themselves. Silence became strategy. Visibility felt risky. Community cohesion strained further. The accumulation of incidents made denial impossible for wider society. Violence forced itself into collective awareness through repetition. Each event reinforced the previous one. Fear compounded rather than faded. By the end of 2019, the war no longer belonged only to those involved directly. Civilians faced consequences daily. Trauma became a shared burden. Control slipped beyond containment. This year marked a turning point where avoidance failed as a coping mechanism. Fear went public and stayed present. Violence defined the atmosphere rather than the exception. The city adjusted reluctantly. The arrival of the pandemic in early 2020 interrupted the war briefly, not through peace, but through forced immobility that slowed street-level interaction temporarily. Lockdowns reduced movement, checkpoints limited gatherings, and attention shifted toward survival rather than dominance. Violence dipped during those early months, giving the impression that pressure alone could suppress conflict sustainably. That calm was misleading, since structures remained intact beneath restricted movement. The pause functioned as compression rather than resolution. During lockdowns, planning replaced action across fragmented networks. Leaders communicated through quieter channels, reassessing alliances and stockpiling resources. Younger actors grew restless under confinement, consuming narratives that framed future violence as inevitable release. Economic stress deepened resentment across already strained communities. Once restrictions eased, accumulated pressure sought an immediate outlet. As movement resumed, Killings returned with sharper focus and higher stakes. Major figures who had survived previous waves became targets quickly, removed to create space for repositioning. Each death triggered scrambles for control, since authority remained unstable and contested. Replacement leadership lacked experience, relying on aggression rather than mediation. Escalation followed predictably. The deaths of prominent actors destabilized multiple zones simultaneously. Networks once coordinated through fragile understanding fractured further under leadership vacuums. Opportunistic violence replaced strategic calculation. Crews moved quickly to claim space before rivals adjusted. Mistakes multiplied as speed overtook caution. Pandemic disruption also reshaped criminal economies significantly. Drug routes adjusted as borders tightened, forcing reliance on maritime movement and informal corridors. Profits fluctuated unpredictably, intensifying competition over remaining access. Desperation increased willingness to escalate. Economic uncertainty fed aggression directly. During this period, intelligence reports began surfacing linking local gangs to overseas movement and laundering networks. Authorities traced weapons arriving through regional channels, previously underutilized. Money flowed outward through informal transfer systems connecting Caribbean hubs. Violence no longer appeared purely local. The conflict expanded beyond the island boundaries quietly. These developments altered perception among enforcement agencies. Street war reframed as an organized threat rather than a neighborhood dispute. Intelligence assessments emphasized structure, coordination, and international ties. That shift influenced response strategies significantly. The conflict entered a different category entirely. Within gangs, awareness of increased scrutiny shaped behavior. Some leaders pushed toward deterrent strategies aimed at discouraging interference. Others favored escalation to demonstrate reach and resolve. Debate intensified around how to respond to mounting pressure. Consensus proved impossible. The idea of targeting police emerged gradually within this context. Initially framed as a warning rather than a strategy, threats circulated quietly through channels. The logic followed desperation and deterrence rather than ideology. If pressure intensified, the response would shift upward. Violence became a message rather than an outlet. Early incidents tested boundaries cautiously. Attacks near stations or patrol routes signaled capability without full escalation. Messages circulated suggesting consequences for continued enforcement. These actions aimed to create hesitation rather than confrontation. The line shifted slowly. As enforcement persisted, rhetoric hardened across networks. Police became symbols of interference rather than individuals. Dehumanization eased moral restraint. The threshold for escalation lowered. What began as signaling edged toward execution. By 2022, intelligence warnings increased regarding potential attacks on officers. Prison chatter referenced names, schedules, and routines. Lists circulated intermittently, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes specific. Anxiety spread within law enforcement quietly. Families adjusted routines cautiously. Violence during this phase reflected experimentation rather than a consistent strategy. Some attacks appeared opportunistic, others calculated. Responses varied by faction and leadership. Coordination remained uneven under fragmentation. Uncertainty ruled decision-making. Public incidents involving police amplified fear dramatically. Even unsuccessful attacks carried symbolic weight. The idea that officers could be targeted openly altered their psychological balance. Enforcement confidence wavered. Communities sensed escalation. Overseas connections deepened simultaneously. Weapons traced to external suppliers increased lethality. Money laundering routes diversified beyond traditional channels. These links insulated networks from local disruption. Pressure at home redirected outward rather than inward. Political rhetoric intensified as the threat category shifted officially. Statements emphasized security, sovereignty, and order. Emergency language returned. Structural reform remained absent. Reaction dominated planning again. By late 2023, the war no longer resembled street rivalry alone. It functioned as a layered conflict involving local actors, prisons, and external channels. Police targeting discussions moved from fringe to mainstream within networks. Deterrence logic replaced avoidance. Late 2024 marked the moment when the threat crystallized into an open warning across Trinidad's security landscape. Intelligence reports referenced specific names, routes, and schedules with increasing frequency. Prison conversations confirmed planning rather than posturing. Open threats circulated through informal channels without denial. The line had been crossed. Hit lists surfaced not as singular documents, but as overlapping references across sources. Some lists contradicted others, amplifying confusion and fear. Law enforcement treated all warnings seriously, adjusting routines quietly. Officers altered sleep arrangements, movement patterns, and visibility. Anxiety spread through families and stations. Emergency powers returned as a precaution rather than a reaction. Patrol patterns changed overnight. Checkpoints reappeared and deployments increased visibly. Violence dipped briefly under pressure. Streets quieted again. The pause felt familiar. Beneath that calm, tension remained unresolved and concentrated. Networks interpreted enforcement as a temporary obstacle rather than a solution. Planning resumed quietly. Silence carried weight. Everyone anticipated the next shift. Prison intelligence continued flowing, confirming that containment had not disrupted command structures. Instructions still traveled outward. Leadership remained insulated. Emergency measures affected symptoms rather than sources. The pattern repeated. Communities experienced mixed relief and dread during this phase. Reduced shootings offered temporary comfort. Fear persisted beneath surface calm. Normal routines remained cautious. Trust stayed fractured. Public discourse focused on enforcement success without addressing underlying conditions. Officials emphasized numbers rather than dynamics. Structural causes went largely unspoken. Solutions appeared narrow. History threatened repetition. Violence did not disappear. It compressed again. The pause resembled earlier cycles rather than a turning point. Networks adjusted, waiting patiently. Pressure redistributed rather than removed. Escalation deferred, not denied. This moment underscored the limits of enforcement alone. A war built on structure, memory, and survival resists suppression without transformation. Removing actors does not erase systems. Containment delays without dismantling. The cycle persists. Prisons continued functioning as command spaces despite emergency measures. Leadership adapted quickly. Communication shifted channels. Authority remained intact. The illusion of control resurfaced briefly. As early 2025 approached, warnings persisted without resolution. The absence of immediate violence masked readiness rather than peace. Everyone understood the pause carried conditions. The next chapter awaited opportunity. The conflict stood suspended rather than ended. Memory, grievance, and fragmentation remained active forces. Structures persisted beneath pressure. Survival logic continued shaping behavior.